Welcome to Andrew Jackson, Hero Under Fire. I'm Brian Kilmeade. You know, Andrew Jackson was one of America's most consequential leaders. Over the next hour, we're going to examine the remarkable life of our seventh president and find out why one of the most revered presidents in his day could be so controversial in our day. His legacy is now under attack in many circles, and as calls mount to take down many iconic Jackson monuments, we're going to hear from both sides of that argument. I've been researching Jackson for my new book, Andrew Jackson and the Miracle of New Orleans, and I'll show you just how important that battle was in shaping the America that we have today. We're going to travel to the legendary Kilmeade battlefield in New Orleans, to the White House, and to Jackson's home and final resting place, the Hermitage in beautiful Nashville, Tennessee. Most people would recognize Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill or iconic paintings like this one by Steve Penley, which is brilliant. But to truly understand who Andrew Jackson was, you need to understand the moment that defined him, which came at the end of America's second war of independence, so to speak, the War of 1812. So we begin perhaps with his most impressive feat, forming, melding, and motivating an army to stop the most fearsome force in the world at the time, the British infantry. The Kilmeade battlefield, the premier battle in the Battle of New Orleans. What is this? This is a cannon Jackson used. What is that? That's the protection of Jackson's troops. What was over there? The British, outnumbering us 2-1. What Jackson did after that still has military historians befuddled. But I'll give it away. We won. Although the Revolutionary War officially ended in 1783, the British never truly accepted America's victory. In fact, it resulted in another war, the War of 1812. And things were not looking good at the start for the United States.
We were so weak that we couldn't, nor could any other country, challenge what they called the Leviathans of the Deep, the British Navy. 6,000 Americans became prisoners on board British ships.
Our country does not really have a standing army, as a shell of a navy, but yet we declared war because we want to stand up for ourselves and send everyone a message. And early on, the message was, we're weak.
We start off very badly. We've got just the worst generals. We got no plan.
Washington is burned to the ground.
Yes.
Our president barely escapes.
Yes. They set it ablaze, and then they come out and race back to their ships and leave.
That seems to mobilize America. People thought, wait a second. I might not have been for this war, but our country could be destroyed right now. We have to rally. In December 1814, the Treaty of Ghent is signed, officially ending the war. On paper, that is. It did nothing to stop the British troops in the battlefield.
Great Britain really thought the Louisiana Purchase was bogus, that we really didn't own the Louisiana territory, that it belonged to Spain, that Napoleon never had a right to sell it to us.
So the British headed south towards Louisiana.
The stated goal of the British in their attack plan was to confine this fledgling United States between the Mississippi River and the East Coast.
If you lose the Mississippi, America would be a prisoner in their own country, forbidden to move west.
This battle was for all of westward expansion.
The British are coming in full confidence. Some of them brought their wives.
The British were thought that they were going to be able to have a Christmas celebration in New Orleans. They'd be able to feast here, that they would be able to take over the comforts, take over the plantations.
The job of stopping them fell to the commander of the Tennessee militia, Major General Andrew Jackson.
Most everybody figures the war is lost. New Orleans is in a panic. The government wants to surrender. The British aren't even here. Well, let's just surrender.
The people of New Orleans were unbelievably tense. Why? Because the British were just miles away. They didn't know if they were going to face oppression or be able to keep the freedom that America offered them just 3 weeks prior to the war. It was up to Jackson to let them know he's got them covered.
And so he declares martial law, and he says, no, he says, I'm here, and they shall not pass except over my dead body.
The historic French Quarter, Charters in St. Louis. Why would I bring you to this intersection? Because it was right here in this building, 200 plus years ago, where Andrew Jackson met with his generals, and they sketched out a battle plan to take on the British. It was nothing short of brilliant and yielded unparalleled success.
He had no background. He had never led anything in combat, but he has this innate ability to see what's going on, see what needs to be done.
And Jackson here started doing recruitment, and his view is anybody who had a gun was welcome to serve in Andrew Jackson's army.
His mishmash of troops that comes in, part Choctaw Indians, Kentucky and Tennessee militia, 2 units from the Army, 7th and 44th, 62 United States Marines, and Beale's rifles and 3 men of color.
He paid whites and people of color the exact same fee. Said, join our side. We don't care what your past is. I mean, we're talking about Jean Lafitte and the pirates that Jackson brings into the scene. You know, these were outlaws.
He did not want the pirates to be at all involved. He called them the hellish banditti. I'll have nothing to do with them. Until someone told him, look, they can provide you with 30,000 rounds of ammunition and the powder to go with it. Swear them in.
That was it.
You're suddenly just pulling everybody in from people are working kitchens and plantations. A little bit of everybody stood up to defend their city.
Jackson knew that one thing would be the key to victory. This was all about the Mississippi.
It channelized the British Army. So when the British Army wanted to attack Jackson's line, he had to fit his army between the Mississippi River and an impenetrable swamp about 800 yards away. New Orleans is to our north, about 7 to 9 miles. The British land below New Orleans. The British know that the waters get too shallow to bring the fleet in. They can't really come upriver. The current is just terrible. So they're going to make a landing with their army and come down and seize this undefended city.
But it's not undefended. Jackson had anticipated exactly where they would land and prepared the land for battle, digging a moat-like canal and building a mud berm.
Jackson comes in and digs in along this line with the Rodriguez Canal, where he sets his force behind it, almost 800 yards.
When we come back, how that simple man-made berm might have saved the United States as we know it today. Plus, we're going to hear from the people who want to tear down the monuments of Andrew Jackson and get a behind-the-scenes tour of his beautiful home.
Now, this is the front parlor of the mansion. And if you were coming to visit President Jackson or former President Jackson, you would have been invited to come in here and wait for him. And he would have let you wait long enough to look at the things he had in this room that would tell you he's an important man. For example, it was him winning the Battle of New Orleans that really catapulted him to national fame. This is a British bayonet that a cypress tree had grown up around from Chalmette, where the battle was fought.
Wow.
So
they were able to get that out of the tree and bring it here. So he had this?
This was his. He owned it. As a president, there were a lot of parallels to him and George Washington. He was held in the same status. So there are things around the house that have a Washington connection, like the writing crop here on the chair is made from a vine that grew on Washington's tomb.
By late December 1814, nearly 15,000 British troops were outside New Orleans, with their eyes set on the city, control of that city, and the entire Mississippi River. Major General Andrew Jackson and his ragtag soldiers were heavily outnumbered, but Jackson's plan to create a barrier out of mud and river would prove extremely effective. This berm, this protection, this wall was built in a matter of weeks, miles long, to protect Andrew Jackson and the American troops. Over there were thousands of British troops. What they wanted was over there. That was New Orleans. What they wanted to control was over there, the Mississippi. What's at stake? The future of the country. What did Andrew Jackson do? Win.
The battlefield really was approximately 4 miles long. The width was always the same between the river and the swamp.
If you look at it from the British perspective, even with a scope, you can't see that canal was there. So you think you're just going over an earthenwork, but when you get there, you got to go down and then up, and it was 8 feet of water. You had to like wade across it up. Well, at that point, you could just shoot them like fish in a barrel. So Jackson had created a giant booby trap for the British.
And they all man along this line. They're not going to go out and engage the British. Jackson knows that would be suicidal. And once he dug in here, no one moved him out. This is a part of the berm, or the Jackson's line.
I'm struck that even 200 years, this berm still sits here.
But remember, that would have been dug out 6 or 7 feet deep, and the spoil on top added another 6 feet So the British coming across would have had to have negotiated this 12 to 15 foot wide canal, put ladders up, and scale this to have any chance. A really formidable task. The cannons, their barrels were cut through the mud, so just the barrels stuck out. So there was no target at all for the British to shoot at.
It's an ancient kind of warfare that took place here. I mean, we think of modern warfare, but yet it's trench warfare.
And guess what? If this berm didn't work, there was another line and another line they'd have to go through before they get to New Orleans, but they never got past this line.
That's right.
January 8th, 1850. After 3 weeks of fighting small battles, the British finally launched a massive assault on Jackson's dug-in position.
As we look out here, there's a British flag in the back. That's where the British came in.
That's where they launched their attack from.
But that's a killing field.
Yes.
You had these sharpshooters taking them out like it's a video game. And in the end, over 2,000 are wounded or killed. And for America, under 50.
Yeah, 13, 20, some people say. The whole casualties for the entire 3-week campaign was close to 200. The attacking British have made ladders and fascines, as they call them, bundles of sugarcane to throw in to lessen the height and then put the ladder up to scale it.
That's a suicide mission.
Yeah, well, and it was a suicide mission. That's exactly what happened. It took too much time to go down and up, so they were bound and destined to get slaughtered.
And you don't just have riflemen here shooting at you. You've got these cannons firing grape shot and canister shot into your ranks. There were a variety of cannons. The largest were these 24-pounders. These came off of the schooner Carolina after it had been attacked. The gun crew wheeled it in. The barrel is through the berm. The group captain set the touch hole off and kaboom.
The British had to do this. They had to drag their own through the swamp.
60 miles. Ammunition was certainly a problem, so ingenuity said stuff anything down this barrel. So if you had horseshoes, if you had candlesticks, anything that was metal, nails, doorknobs, whatever they could put in here that would form a lethal flying projectile went in.
Just goes to show you, everyone in New Orleans on some way was in that fight, because those doorknobs and things had to come off somebody's doors.
Exactly.
This becomes a bloodbath here. The corpses, well, now we're just looking at green grass. It was the beginning of the end of Britain, and in many ways the birth of modern America.
Why would I be outside a convent when I'm trying to tell the Battle of New Orleans? Because this isn't just any convent. This is the home of the Ursuline nuns. It dates back hundreds of years. They prayed for Jackson's success. And among the people who think that these nuns brought him a miraculous victory, Major General Andrew Jackson himself.
We are standing at the Old Ursuline Convent, and it is the oldest building in the Mississippi Valley. The Ursulines arrived here in 1727 and started their mission to educate young women, as well as to care for the men and soldiers that were at the hospital.
3 weeks before the War of 1812, Louisiana becomes a state, and the war is raging, and it's going terribly. But suddenly things start to turn around, and the breaking point is the Battle of New Orleans. Why would I be standing in a convent talking about a Battle of New Orleans?
So while the men went to the battlefield, the women came to church to pray.
Andrew Jackson loved the fact that the nuns of New Orleans, the Ursuline nuns, were praying for victory. It gave his troops morale. It gave them a feel, the nuns gave a feel that God is on our side.
They're all praying the night of the battle to what they call Our Lady of Prompt Succor, Our Lady of Immediate Help, the Blessed Virgin.
They're here praying all night long. At 6 o'clock in the morning, they start Mass.
They were really going at it, you know, devotional candles and prayers for Andrew Jackson. It spread throughout the heavily Catholic town of New Orleans that the Catholic Church is praying for you, the nuns are praying.
Father Duberg says Mass, and during communion, there's a runner that comes in and yells, "Victory is ours." And the entire church drops to their knees.
They prayed for the victory. It was a miraculous victory, and they attribute a lot of that to their prayers.
They sing the Te Deum, which is the song of thanksgiving for a mass.
After the battle, Jackson went and paid homage to them, visited with them, and thanked them. And also, they were extraordinary nurses. So all of our wounded and some of the British wounded were taken care of by these nuns.
From then on, for the last over 200 years, have kept that promise to sing that Mass of Thanksgiving because they believe that prayer is what won that battle.
Still to come, the battle over the many statues and monuments of Andrew Jackson that some people want to tear down. Plus, we're going to head to the White House and see why other presidents have been influenced so heavily by America's 7th president, including, by the way, our current commander-in-chief. And we're going to travel to Nashville, Tennessee for a behind-the-scenes tour of Andrew Jackson's beautiful home, the Hermitage.
We're going into the dining room of Andrew Jackson's home, and it's the largest room in the house, but it would be a very important place for the Jacksons to meet with their friends, for Jackson to meet with political colleagues in this room. The interesting thing is that Jackson didn't sit at the end of the table where you would think a president would sit. He liked to sit in the middle of the table so he could talk to people at either end of the table equally.
So Andrew Jackson's interaction with the Ursuline nuns is just one of the remarkable things that happened in his life. I mean, his whole life was just full of obstacles. Think about this. He was a kid that grew up in the backwoods of the Carolinas. He ends up in a mansion like this, surrounded by 1,100 acres after being a 2-term president. Well, what did he overcome? A lot, and a lot early. Tell me about this General Jackson. He wants revenge on the British.
Yes.
Why?
First of all, he's a young boy and he gets slashed by a British officer for failure to shine his boots. He's taken prisoner. His mother bails him out, but then she eventually dies of smallpox, and his older brother loses his life. His family is wiped out in the Revolutionary War, and he never, ever forgives the British. He hates them for the rest of his life.
By 1796, Tennessee becomes a state, and he puts a lot of his ardor, instead of being resentful to the British, into a positive sense of the new state of Tennessee.
When he first bought the Hermitage in 1804, he was a rising political star here in Tennessee. He was head of the Tennessee militia. He fought a duel 2 years later that disrupted his career path. This is the best way to put it. But he had already been a U.S. congressman, he'd already been a U.S. senator. He had been on what we would consider today the Tennessee Supreme Court.
He goes on and works in the Indian Wars, and he's able to take control over Florida. We probably wouldn't have Florida as part of the United States if it wasn't for Andrew Jackson.
He was the first military governor of Florida when Florida became a territory of the United States, when we acquired it from Spain. He was only governor for a few months and basically was sent there by President Monroe to impose American law on what had been a Spanish colony.
That's why we got Jacksonville named after him. Jackson, Mississippi, Jackson, Tennessee. You start going to the South, Andrew Jackson's considered almost like a founding father in the South.
What's his leadership philosophy? How did he do this?
He had intimidation, but I think more by example, and then he could be exceedingly funny and kind. If you were performing well, he could throw the compliments on you. So he knew, like any good general, that right mixture of control, but also fatherly caring.
Gotcha.
That he thought that the people that were really serving with him were his brothers in arms.
The portraits on the walls, these are officers that served under Jackson who were very loyal to him. And if you were loyal to Jackson, you were in good condition.
We can't overestimate what a phenomena he became overnight. It gave our new republic a sustainable hero, one that wasn't part of the Revolutionary War per se, but a new generation coming forward. And we call the War of 1812 the Second American Revolution, and the one pure hero of that was Andrew Jackson.
When Andrew Jackson passed away at the age of 78, buried right here, this is his tomb, it put closure on a remarkable life. A life that wasn't without controversy. Two things stand out most of all. The fact that this plantation was powered by slave labor, as many as 150 at one time. A slave he was closest to, buried right by the general, his name Alfred Jackson, passed away at the age of 98. There was also the year 1830 of his presidency, May of that year, when he signed the Indian Removal Act, pushing 5 Indian tribes westward, in some cases all the way to Oklahoma.
Andrew Jackson used to be ranked usually around number 7 on the presidents and polls of scholars. He's dropped way down now. Part of it is what we call First Peoples, Native American history, because of the Trail of Tears, because of the battles with the Seminole and the Creek and the Cherokee.
The Removal Act called for the removal of the 5 tribes from the southeast United States to move to what is modern-day Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears actually happened later after Jackson's presidency. It's somewhat become the term for all Indian removal, but the Trail of Tears itself happened after Jackson's presidency as a result of another treaty that was signed while he was president. It was a horrible experience for all of the Native Americans involved because they were held in holding pens. This is 1838. Until they were removed, and they left so late that they were caught in the winter. So people were sick, they starved. It was a horrible experience. It was Jackson, but it was also the federal government. And we don't excuse him in any way. He was part and parcel of it.
He gets very low marks on human rights. And then add to the fact that he was a slave owner.
There's nothing that would suggest he was morally troubled by the idea of slavery. It was part of the system he was raised in. It's what enabled him to be a general, to be a president, to do the other things that he did, because they were basically here running the plantation and generating the revenue.
The White House, where history is made. When we come back, how many presidents look to Andrew Jackson for inspiration, and how one president is most like Andrew Jackson? That story, when Andrew Jackson, a hero under fire, continues.
This is Jackson's library. And to me, this is the beating heart of the house. This is where he spent most of his time the last 8 years of his life.
Right.
And he was in constant communication with the other presidents that came after him and members of Congress to kind of he was pulling the strings of what was going on.
He still wanted to have influence.
He still wanted to be president, you know, even though we were 900 miles away. So this was that, if you will, a kind of a political epicenter of the country.
1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. Just over there at Lafayette Park is a statue of one Major General Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, arguably one of the most impactful. Think about what he accomplished. He balanced the budget and paid off our debt. No president has done that since. He fought off secession successfully. And keep in mind, too, we had some controversies. The Indian Removal Act, the abolitionist movement, he actually fought against it. However, so many presidents through time, in times of trouble, looked to Andrew Jackson for inspiration.
President Truman is back in Missouri to see daughter Margaret unveil the statue he presented to independence. An almost life-size bronze of his favorite historic American, Andrew Jackson.
Just to characterize Andrew Jackson, I know FDR loved him, Truman worshipped him, Teddy Roosevelt wrote a book about him, Lincoln referred to him constantly.
Right.
Why?
Because he was a leader.
FDR identified with Andrew Jackson when he took on New York special interest. Right on the other side of the statue, FDR in 1937 had his reviewing stand for the inaugural parade, and it was a replica of the Hermitage because FDR identified with Jackson.
From the time Jackson lived here, we've had 15 presidents visit the Hermitage. Theodore Roosevelt visited here and made some wonderful statements about Jackson.
Theodore Roosevelt just worshiped the heroism of Andrew Jackson. He would steal a page from Andrew Jackson in the Battle of Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. Ride your horse right into the enemy so all your men see your valor. Worst case scenario, you die. Jackson represented that you have to put your life on the line for country.
Abraham Lincoln, when he was elected president, he asked for Andrew Jackson's papers so he could study them and draw on them to write his inaugural address.
And that's what's on that statue, at the foot of his statue. The Union must be preserved.
Harry Truman identified with him because he felt the Boston, New York, Washington society didn't approve of him.
There's this wonderful quote of Truman's where he said he was for the little guy the guy who had no pull, and that's what a president is supposed to do. And Truman commissioned 2 statues of Jackson, one in Independence, Missouri, and one in Kansas City. And Truman actually came here to measure Jackson's clothes to make sure that the statues were the right size. Reagan was here in 1981 to put a wreath on Jackson's tomb for his birthday that year. You know, in many ways, I see parallels between Reagan and Jackson. They were both sort of outsiders to Washington. They'd both been in politics. But Reagan came to the presidency with a very determined agenda that he got through during his 2 terms, as did Jackson.
Just think, how many presidents looked out that North Portico window at the Andrew Jackson statue for inspiration? A lot. Well, there's one in particular that's most like Andrew Jackson. He actually lives there right now. He's President Donald Trump. And the similarities between him and Jackson did not escape him as he took me and my Fox and Friends co-host on an Oval Office tour.
Why did you put that up?
Well, they say that his campaign and his whole thing was most like mine. It was interesting. That was 1828. They used to go back to Ronald Reagan. Now they're going back to Andrew Jackson, but that's the great Andrew Jackson, who actually was a great general, and he was a great president, but a controversial president.
So President Trump sees the similarities between Andrew Jackson and himself. But what about the historians?
Like Donald Trump, he used the technology of his day. Trump uses Twitter. Andrew Jackson pioneered the use of lithography, which is an artist rendering that's mass-produced. And it transformed politics because they could hand you this picture. Remember, most of America was illiterate. They hand you this color picture. This is mine, this is yours, you can take it. Who's that? That's the man running for president we're voting for.
Right.
His opponent, short, bald, stout, stern looking.
Who are you talking about?
John Quincy Adams. And here's Andrew Jackson, sexy with flowing hair. And what's this? It's the Battle of New Orleans. What's that? He won the Battle of New Orleans. It was as good as TV. So everybody got their own lithograph. So Jackson, like Trump, was into the latest technology.
They're similar in some of their temperamental issues and how Jackson was volatile, could be volatile, and they were both outsiders, but there were different types of outsiders. President Trump was an outsider to politics, and Jackson was a geographic outsider. He was not one of the Virginia aristocrats or an Adams from Massachusetts. He was from the other side of the Allegheny Mountains.
Very much against the elite, Andrew Jackson, as he defined them, because life on the western frontier was different. He knew that people in Boston didn't really understand what it was like to live in western North Carolina.
Many say he was the first celebrity in American history. Big crowds followed him wherever he went, and he warred with his own cabinet, like Trump. He warred with the Senate, like Trump.
Andrew Jackson despised erroneous news stories, what we call fake news today. But even more than that, he despised any time his reputation was smeared in the public prints. He would just throw a rage. And he spent a lot of his public career seeking revenge on journalists.
Andrew Jackson loved his wife, Rachel, and when he was elected president of the United States, Rachel went to Nashville to buy a dress with all her girlfriends, and they were in these stores, and she found these old stacks of newspapers. They had hidden them from her, and his opponents called her a bigamist and an adulterer. She was a very religious, devout woman, and it broke her heart. She went back to the Hermitage. She went to bed. She died of a heart attack. She never set foot in the White House, and it broke his heart, and it made him angry. And he organized what later became the Jackson Papers. It was a chain of newspapers, and they were vicious, and they went after their political opponents.
What's fascinating, if you leaf through these, are his marginal notes, where he'd read the paper and then he'd write comments in the margins.
Right.
This is good or bad, or there's one article in particular that really took him to task, and there's a great big X through the whole article in ink.
Donald Trump brags on being a counterpuncher. Well, so was Andrew Jackson in battle, as you know very well because you write about it, and in politics, and also in duels. And Andrew Jackson was in a duel with a perfect shot as his opponent. He let him shoot first. He opened his chest and said, "Go for it." And the perfect shot shot and apparently missed. Andrew Jackson didn't even flinch. He coolly, deliberately aimed and shot the man dead. Afterwards, they learned he had been shot 2 inches from his heart, and he carried that bullet till he died.
Up next, Senator Mike Lee says some of the most influential founding fathers have been written out of history. He will tell us why. Welcome back to Andrew Jackson, Hero Under Fire. I'm Brian Kilmeade. You know, Senator Mike Lee says that many important historical figures in our past are being whitewashed in today's politically correct times. He sat down with me to discuss his new book, Written Out of History, The Forgotten Founders Who Fought Big Government. Senator, in your book, Written Out of History, you remarkably go over what are some of the main things with Andrew Jackson's experiencing right now. How they want to take one of these great American characters, presidents, generals, and want to recast him. Does that bother you?
Sure. Anytime we take someone in history, especially an important historical figure like Andrew Jackson, and we try to denigrate him as all bad, or even if we take someone and say they were all good, we're setting people up for disappointment. We're setting people up to be misinformed about history. The fact is, Andrew Jackson, like so many other people in our history, wasn't perfect, but he was a great man, and he did a lot of things that had a deep impact on the American people.
And when he died, he was considered a great president. What happened to Jackson now that didn't happen then?
So many people today want to put our modern stamp on historical figures. It's one of the reasons why in my book, Written Out of History, I talk a lot about Aaron Burr. A lot of people dismiss Aaron Burr. He's just the guy who shot Alexander Hamilton. That's all we know of him. When in fact, he did a lot to stand up for the rights of the individual. And you have to know that whole story. So too with Andrew Jackson. I mean, look, he has literally physically impacted the footprint of Washington, D.C. He had the Treasury building built so as to obstruct the view from the White House of the Capitol.
He was a guy that was literally a true American. I mean, born here, fights in the Revolutionary War here, wins one of the key battles in American history here, and then becomes president here, a senator, a congressman. What's so bad?
Well, people can't handle that because they can't handle certain things about his life, things that don't coincide well, that don't mesh well with the way we approach things today. The fact that people committed sins back then that are no longer around today makes it really easy for us to cast judgment on them. We have to remember a lot of the good things that he did do. For example, he would actually read legislation and review it for constitutionality. He would veto legislation if he thought it exceeded Congress's power under the Constitution. That almost doesn't happen today, and yet it needs to. We would do well to follow his example.
Andrew Jackson thought the founders were being forgotten. He thought that it was too much about Virginia and Washington and Massachusetts. What about everybody else?
That's right. They forget about the fact that he helped a lot of people feel more connected to their government. He helped a lot of people feel like there was someone in Washington standing up for them.
If you look at the war in which he wins the key battle, the future of our country is definitely in the balance. So does he not deserve credit for that? The other things that we look at that are wrong now, should we discredit what he did then?
We certainly can't discount what he did, and what he did was heroic. You know, to this day, there are lasting reminders of the War of 1812 inside the Capitol. In the Majority Leader's office in the Senate, there is a crack in a fireplace that was there. That crack originated from a fire started by the British during the War of 1812. That fire heated the stone to the point that it lost some of its structural integrity. We can still see that crack there today. The reason that that crack is limited, the reason that that war didn't end differently, had a whole lot to do with Andrew Jackson.
What concerns you most about the way we're viewing history today through the modern lens?
When we sanitize history, when we take certain figures and we try to denigrate them, marginalize them, write them out of history, if you will, we lose part of our heritage. We are destined to repeat that portion of history that we forget. And so that's why if we write people off, people like Andrew Jackson, simply because their story or certain aspects of their life might offend us today, we run the risk of ignoring their great contributions and run the risk of avoiding some of the same mistakes they might have made. Every time we identify someone as having made a mistake, and because they made a mistake, they're unworthy of being remembered, we're going to be forgetting about a whole lot of people. I mean, we'll be writing a whole lot of presidents, basically all of them, out of history, if that's the standard.
Up next, how could one of the most revered presidents in his day be so controversial in our day? Hear why some people want monuments to Jackson torn down. That story when we return. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. You know, over the past few months, we've seen controversy and debate break out all over America's past as activists try to convince local governments to remove statues, mostly of controversial historical figures, most of them monuments to Confederate leaders. Most notably, the plan to remove Confederate General Robert E. Lee's statue in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was one of the flashpoints that set off violent clashes between neo-Nazi groups and anti-fascist counter-protesters back in August. But even before all the chaos erupted, I went down to take a look at the controversy surrounding the statue of the man credited with saving New Orleans more than 2 centuries ago. Major General Andrew Jackson. What he did is still mind-boggling. He put together an army in a matter of weeks that held off the finest fighting force in the world at that time, the British Army, and saved a city. Honestly, saved a country in the big picture. But yet some are saying, not impressed. We want to diminish Jackson, and it's going to start by taking this statue down.
As we approach the 300th year in New Orleans, cannot go forward until we erase that negative past.
Malcolm Suber leads a group called Take 'Em Down NOLA. They've been successfully fighting for the removal of statues across the city. He now has his sights set on Andrew Jackson.
We took down 4 of the Confederate statues that were proposed by Mayor Mitch Landrieu. But our position from the very beginning has been that all monuments to white supremacy, to slaveholding, must be removed from our public square.
You don't look at Andrew Jackson as a hero?
Andrew Jackson is probably the most hated of the statues that we have in this city.
Why?
Because Andrew Jackson was not only a slaveholder who held more than 300 Africans in slavery, but he was also the architect of the Trail of Tears, which meant that he was in charge of the murder of more than 10,000 Native people. And for those reasons, we don't think that he needs any veneration whatsoever.
Do you think it's proper to put today's values on people from 200 years ago?
Of course. I mean, we wouldn't be fighting this fight today if we didn't think it was proper.
Your history book would be blank, Malcolm. Slavery, despicable. The way treatment of Indians in certain cases, indisputably bad. Gotcha. But if you're going to look back on history and try to cleanse it, we'll have no history.
We're not cleansing it. We're saying that in public spaces that we control, now, today, we decide what goes in our public spaces. And that is not to be decided by some racists who put it up to venerate white supremacy.
You don't see any positive in Andrew Jackson?
Not in me. I don't. I don't see anything aside from acknowledging that he was the 7th president, that he was an adequate general, but a despicable human being. And we don't honor despicable human beings. That's my opinion.
As statues come down all across the South, including New Orleans, some residents are fighting to keep Jackson in Jackson Square.
Right now, there's a big effort for the last 2 years to take down several monuments, about 20, of NOLA history.
Andrew Jackson was a fantastic hero in saving New Orleans, and the world owes him a lot in the sense of this country, which is freedom.
But why would some people want to take it down?
Well, you know, I don't think anyone really understands. If you go out there where the battle happened, there are plaques. And the plaques say that 450 men of color fought under Andrew Jackson. So here you have people saying take him down because he owned slaves. And when this battle was won, opened up America, really. New Orleans became a city that thrived.
You don't erase history. History is what everybody wants to read in books. You don't burn books.
Andrew Jackson came down here with a bullet in him and dysentery and figured out how to build a blockade about 9 miles south of New Orleans to stop the British from coming in. 15,000 British soldiers he stopped with a ragtag group of Louisianans. So it's a monument to Louisiana. You put the general on there, but you're really honoring everybody that fought.
How did we get to this point that you have to fight to keep history?
Brian, I'd ask the same question, because this has gone through 100 years of history.
He fought a battle that saved the country, and he's being honored for that in New Orleans, and he's being honored for that in other parts of the country that recognize how important that battle was. As the years go by, we typically forget how important that was in 1815 when he won. But now we want to judge him by what we need today, as opposed to forgetting what he contributed to the country.
All right, that's all the time we have. Thanks so much for joining us. And don't forget to check out my new book, Andrew Jackson and the Miracle of New Orleans. Hope you like it. And if you have the chance, do yourself a favor and plan a visit to the Hermitage. You can walk around the very grounds where Andrew Jackson lived and thrived in his remarkable life and learn more about the hero under fire.